Eleanor Hayes opened the letter, expecting a routine notice, until she saw the fine, $400, for a flower bed, the very roses she and her late husband had planted together. Her hands tightened around the paper, her pulse steady. Across the street, Karen Fenn, HOA President, smirked from her porch, clipboard in hand, convinced she had already won. But what Karen didn't know? Eleanor wasn't just any homeowner, she was a Supreme Court judge. And the game Karen was playing? She was about to lose in a way she never saw coming. This story is going to make your blood boil. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA? Then you need to hear this. Stick around, because by the end, you'll be cheering for justice. And if you hate HOA bullies, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to see it. Also, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to hear from you. Eleanor had always played by the rules. Not because she had to, but because she believed in them. Rules, when used correctly, created order. They ensured fairness, protected the vulnerable, and upheld justice. This belief had guided her through decades of her career, standing firm in courtrooms where power-hungry bureaucrats, corrupt officials, and manipulative liars had tried and failed to twist the law to serve their own ends. She had seen it all. She had fought it all. But nothing had prepared her for this. A letter. A single, neatly folded letter tucked into her mailbox. It looked innocent at first, like any other notice. But when she opened it, her fingers stiffened, her breath caught, and something inside her turned to ice. A $400 fine for a flower bed, her flower bed, the one she and her late husband Daniel had planted together all those years ago. Her mind drifted back unbidden to that golden afternoon when Daniel stood beside her, dirt under his nails, sweat glistening on his brow, his deep, warm laugh filling the air. "You sure you want roses? They're stubborn, just like you," he had teased, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead as they dug together. She had smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's exactly why I want them. They'll last." And they had. Even after he was gone, the roses had flourished, a silent tribute to their love. Now, according to the HOA, they were a violation. Eleanor reread the notice, willing herself to stay calm. It had to be a mistake. Some clerical error. But then she saw the signature at the bottom. Karen Fenn, HOA President. Karen Fenn. The name was practically stamped in arrogance, each letter inked with the smug confidence of a woman who had never been challenged. Eleanor clenched her jaw. She had heard whispers from her neighbors, stories of unfair fines, ridiculous citations, and HOA meetings where Karen ruled like a queen. Still, Eleanor had given her the benefit of the doubt, until now. The next morning, she penned a polite, professional response. She cited the HOA's own regulations, explaining that her flower bed predated her residency and was therefore exempt from any new policies. She hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office, fully expecting reason to prevail. It didn't. A second letter arrived a week later. This time it wasn't just a fine, it was a demand. $400, non-negotiable, to be paid by the end of the month. The wording was sharper, the tone almost mocking. Final notice. Failure to pay this fine will result in escalated enforcement measures. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read it. Not with fear, but with something deeper, something raw. Grief. The roses were more than flowers. They were all she had left of Daniel. They had survived storms, the harshest winters, and the passage of time. And now some petty tyrant with a clipboard wanted to erase them with the stroke of a pen? No. This wasn't just about flowers. It wasn't about some petty HOA rule. This was about control, about a woman who saw power as a weapon, who enjoyed forcing people to bend. And Eleanor had spent her entire career standing against people like her. She could have ignored it. She could have paid the fine just to make it go away. But that wasn't who she was. She had never backed down from a fight that mattered. Then came the third letter. Eleanor almost laughed when she saw it. Almost. It wasn't just another fine, it was a threat. Immediate action required. Failure to comply will result in HOA-approved remediation. Remediation, a sanitized word for destruction. They were planning to rip her roses out. Eleanor gripped the letter, her knuckles white. She could almost hear Karen's condescending voice, taste the satisfaction that woman would feel watching her surrender. But Eleanor didn't scare, and she sure as hell didn't submit. She folded the letter carefully, smoothed out the creases, and set it beside the others. Then she took a deep breath, rolled back her shoulders, and smiled. Karen Fenn had just made a mistake. A very, very big mistake. Because Eleanor wasn't just another homeowner, she was the law, and this was war. The first thing Eleanor did was research the HOA's bylaws. She wasn't just annoyed, she was furious. The nerve of Karen Fenn slapping her with a $400 fine for something so harmless, so deeply personal. But this wasn't just about her. Eleanor had spent her life fighting injustice, and this reeked of something much bigger. She sat at her desk, cracked her knuckles, and began her deep dive. And just as she suspected, there was nothing about flower beds requiring approval, nothing in the HOA's publicly available guidelines, nothing in the historical records of past violations, but what she did find, a pattern, selective enforcement. Some people were fined relentlessly, while others, close friends of Karen, got away with glaring violations. Eleanor started making a list. The more she wrote, the more her hands trembled with controlled fury. A retired veteran, Mark Henderson, fined $1,200 for a slightly off-white garage door. A man who had served his country, sacrificed years of his life, only to come home and be tormented by an overzealous HOA president. Eleanor found an interview in the local paper. Mark had paid the fine with his savings. He had called the HOA to protest, only to be met with condescension. "Rules are rules," Karen had said to him. The same woman who left her own deck extension unapproved for years. A single mother, Rachel Porter, forced to pay $400 for a non-compliant security camera, while others had the exact same model. Rachel had 2 kids, worked 2 jobs, and lived in constant fear of break-ins. The HOA didn't care. They fined her, drained her already thin wallet, and when she begged for leniency, Karen's response had been a cold, bureaucratic rejection letter. Rachel's kids had to go without new school supplies that month. A family, the Gonzalez family, nearly evicted over minor lawn debris. Their youngest daughter had been hospitalized for weeks after a sudden illness. The father, juggling hospital visits and work, had fallen behind on yard maintenance. A few leaves, a fallen branch, and suddenly they were drowning in fines. $100 here, $200 there, until the total was over $3,000. They had to beg neighbors for help, scraping together every dime to avoid losing their home. An elderly woman, Margaret Wilson, was fined repeatedly for having a ramp leading up to her front door. Margaret, bound to a wheelchair, had no choice. Her son had built the ramp to ensure she could enter and leave her home safely, but to Karen, it was an eyesore. Margaret's appeals were met with the same cold response: remove it or pay. A Muslim family, the Alice, received a warning for having a decorative crescent moon in their front yard during Ramadan. The HOA's excuse? Only holiday decorations approved by the board are allowed, yet Christmas lights and Halloween decorations remained untouched. The Ali family felt singled out, unwelcome in a neighborhood they had called home for years. A black couple, James and Olivia Carter, found themselves fined for minor infractions no one else in the neighborhood was cited for: grass a half-inch too high, their trash bins left out 30 minutes too long. The message was clear: Karen didn't want them there. Eleanor sat back, the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just Karen being petty, this was targeted harassment. This was cruelty masked as order. Fueled by rage and a need for justice, Eleanor pulled every resource she had. She called in favors, reached out to legal contacts, and pored over documents well into the night. She scoured meeting minutes, tracked past cases of selective enforcement, and combed through testimonials from neighbors who had been victimized. Her hands trembled as she took notes. Karen had built an empire of fear, wielding HOA rules like a weapon, crushing anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of perfection. Eleanor clenched her fists. This wasn't about a flower bed anymore. This was war, and Eleanor was going to make sure Karen Fenn lost everything. The sun had barely risen when Eleanor laced up her sneakers, stepping outside with a quiet but determined purpose. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of morning dew and freshly cut grass, but Eleanor wasn't here to enjoy the tranquility. No, she was on a mission. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the neighborhood with the precision of a hawk. Every step she took carried the weight of silent fury. This wasn't just about her flower bed anymore. This was about justice. This was about exposing the hypocrisy festering in Meadowbrook Estates like a hidden rot beneath freshly painted walls. Her camera hung from her neck, her fingers tightening around its cold metal body. Not a single homeowner was outside yet. Good. That meant she could work undisturbed. Her first stop was 2 doors down. There, standing tall like a monument of arrogance, was Karen's illegal deck extension. Eleanor tilted her head, studying it with an almost academic interest. The wood was new, the varnish fresh. A clear violation, yet no fine had ever been issued. She snapped a picture, the sound of the shutter echoing through the empty street. She turned to Karen's fence next. Too high, too imposing. HOA guidelines dictated a strict height limit, but clearly, rules only applied to those outside Karen's inner circle. Click. Another photo. Eleanor's chest tightened with a mix of anger and something deeper, betrayal. This wasn't just some overzealous rule enforcement. This was corruption at its most insidious. Karen had weaponized the HOA to control, to punish, to break people down while exempting herself from every rule she enforced, and no one had dared to challenge her. Until now. She moved further down the street, pausing in front of Karen's driveway. A line of trash bins sat there, bloated and overfilled, their contents spilling onto the pavement. HOA collection times were strict, and violations were met with swift, merciless fines. Eleanor knew this well. She had seen the notices plastered on her neighbors' doors like warnings from a tyrant, and yet Karen's bins sat there, untouched, unchallenged. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she raised the camera. Click. A strange, bitter laugh bubbled up inside her, but she swallowed it down. There was no humor in this, only injustice, only the suffocating weight of a woman drunk on power, believing herself untouchable. But Karen had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated the wrong person. Eleanor was not just any homeowner. She was a Supreme Court judge, and she had spent her entire career taking down people like Karen. She turned the corner, her steps measured and calm, but inside, her pulse pounded like a war drum. She was building something here, not just a case, but a reckoning. Karen had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, but Eleanor was about to rip that fist apart finger by finger. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small notepad where she had begun listing every violation. The list was growing longer by the second. Unapproved paint colors, an unauthorized shed, lawn decorations that violated HOA aesthetic policies, the very same infractions that had drained her neighbors' bank accounts, only this time they belonged to the enforcer herself. As she scribbled, her mind raced with memories of every tearful homeowner she had seen, people afraid to fight back, people who had been bullied into submission by fines, threats, and Karen's condescending smirk. Not anymore. She took one final deep breath, the morning air filling her lungs like fuel to a growing fire. She had enough evidence now to burn Karen's entire empire to the ground, but Eleanor wasn't done yet. Oh no, this was only the beginning. She straightened her posture, slipping her camera back into her bag. There was still much to do, but for the first time since receiving that wretched fine, Eleanor felt something other than rage. She felt victory on the horizon. At the next HOA meeting, Eleanor walked in with quiet confidence. The air inside the clubhouse was thick with tension. A quiet storm brewing beneath the polite murmurs of gathered homeowners. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the crowded room. At the center of it all, seated like a queen upon her throne, was Karen Fenn. Karen, smug as ever, leaned back in her chair with an insufferable smirk. She was the type of person who thrived on control, who believed she was untouchable. And why wouldn't she? For years she had bullied, fined, and threatened homeowners into submission, and they had always folded. To her, Eleanor was just another name on her list of conquered residents. "Ah, Miss Hayes," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "Here to appeal your violation?" The room chuckled, nervous, uncertain laughter. Some homeowners avoided Eleanor's gaze, others shook their heads, already resigned to the inevitable outcome. After all, no one had ever beaten Karen Fenn. Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of submission. It was slow, measured, like a lioness who had just spotted her prey. "Actually, Karen," Eleanor said, her voice steady, calm, lethal, "I'd like to discuss yours." The smirk on Karen's face faltered for a fraction of a second. A crack in the armor, a flicker of doubt, but she recovered quickly, scoffing as she flipped through her papers, feigning boredom. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice laced with irritation. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The weight of them hit the table with a satisfying thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. "Your fence?" Eleanor began, flipping through the papers. "Too high! That's a violation!" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen shifted in her seat, gripping the armrests just a little tighter. "Your deck? Unauthorized. Another violation." Karen's jaw clenched, her knuckles whitening. Her usual mask of control was beginning to slip. "And your trash bins?" Eleanor continued, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "Left out for 3 days past pickup, a clear breach of HOA policy." Gasps filled the room. Homeowners turned to one another, whispers spreading like wildfire. The mighty Karen Fenn, breaker of wills, enforcer of rules, had been caught breaking them herself. Karen's face drained of color. "This is outrageous." But Eleanor wasn't done. She placed another document on the table. This time there was no mistaking the gravity of what it was. A legal motion. "For years," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering, "this HOA has been operating outside of its legal limits. You have imposed fines that are unlawful. You have bullied homeowners under the guise of neighborhood standards. And now, Karen, I am officially challenging your authority." A hush fell over the room. It was the kind of silence that preceded an earthquake. Homeowners exchanged stunned glances. A few of them, ones who had suffered at Karen's hands, began to nod in understanding, in agreement. Karen's lips trembled, her mind racing for a response, an escape route, but there wasn't one. You can't do this," she stammered, her voice no longer dripping with confidence but with desperation. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp, piercing. "I already have." A man in the back stood up, an elderly gentleman who had been fined thousands for the color of his mailbox. "I support this challenge." A single mother followed. "So do I. Karen charged me $400 for a flower pot that wasn't the right shade." One by one, hands shot into the air. Homeowners, once afraid to speak, now emboldened, now furious. Karen's reign had lasted for years. But tonight it was crumbling before her very eyes. And Eleanor Hayes? She wasn't just another homeowner. She was their reckoning. That night, Eleanor received 6 new violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. A fine for her porch light being too bright. A fine for her garden hose being in view. A fine for a non-approved mailbox, one that had been there for years. They weren't even trying to hide their desperation anymore. And that's when she knew. Karen was scared. Eleanor had been in courtrooms where criminals cracked under pressure. She had seen hardened men crumble when the walls closed in. And now? She recognized the same signs in Karen Fenn. But then, something happened that no one saw coming. It was past midnight when Eleanor heard the soft rustle outside her door. At first, she thought it was just the wind. But as she peered out, her breath caught. A single folder lay on her doorstep, placed there with precision. No note, no explanation, just a thick stack of documents inside. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and flipped through the pages. It took seconds to understand what she was holding, HOA financial records. But these weren't just any records. They were damning. They revealed that Karen Fenn wasn't just issuing unfair fines. She was running a full-scale financial scam. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had been funneled into a personal bank account. Money that should have gone to fixing roads, maintaining parks, or improving the neighborhood had instead been used for luxury vacations, designer handbags, and private club memberships. Eleanor's vision blurred with rage. This wasn't just about a flower bed anymore. This was full-blown fraud. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the folder, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her late husband had always told her that justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about making things right. And right now, that neighborhood needed her. Karen had been preying on people for years, fining them into submission, making them fear losing their homes. She had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, ruling with intimidation and deceit. Not anymore. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. Instead, she gathered everything she needed: legal precedent, court filings, contacts in law enforcement. This was what she did. This was who she was. By dawn, she had a plan. But Karen? She wasn't going down without a fight. The very next day, a foreclosure notice was taped to Eleanor's front door. It was Karen's final move, her last attempt to break her. A power play to show Eleanor that she was in control. But Karen had underestimated her, because while Karen was busy playing dictator, Eleanor had been preparing for war. With one phone call, she set things in motion. She filed lawsuits. She drafted emergency injunctions, legal orders designed to immediately halt any further harm until a court could review the case. Interim injunctions in particular were her weapon of choice. These temporary court orders would prevent the HOA from taking any action against her or other homeowners while the investigation unfolded. No more unjust fines, no more threats of foreclosure, no more intimidation tactics. By the time Karen woke up, her name was already being whispered in places she could never reach, and now there was nothing she could do but watch as her power crumbled before her eyes. And then came the final blow. The state attorney's office received the same folder that had been left on Eleanor's doorstep, and within hours, they opened a full-scale investigation. Karen's smug reign was over. By the time the news broke, it was already too late. Homeowners who had once cowered before Karen now stood outside their homes, watching as her empire crumbled. And when Eleanor finally stepped onto her porch, the neighborhood wasn't just silent, it was free. Karen Fenn had spent years making people feel powerless. Now, she was the one who had lost everything. By the end of the month, the HOA was dissolved. Karen Fenn resigned in disgrace and began facing trial, and the missing HOA funds seized by the state. But the real shocker, the anonymous tip that exposed Karen? It had come from one of her own board members, someone who had grown tired of her corruption and decided to take her down from the inside. Every homeowner who had been unfairly fined received refunds. And Eleanor? She finally got what she wanted. Peace. Justice had been served. But what about you? Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare? Drop your story in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in standing up against HOA bullies, hit that subscribe button, because this is what happens when the little guy fights back. Justice isn't just for the courtroom, it's for everyone